Welcome to Club of Med. Great to see so many people tuning in. We've got a great talk today. We like these to be informal and fun and discussion oriented. Of course, we will have a presentation. We hope, though, that you're going to put comments into the chat, questions into the chat, come up with questions to ask the authors of this really interesting paper. And in short, we call it Club of Med Conversations because we really want to hear from you guys as we're also sharing interesting findings. We do have a couple technical problems happening. A lot of you are coming in with the wrong name. If your name says Jennifer Hurchin and you are not Jennifer, then please change your name. And you can do that by clicking. I think that those little dots on the upper right-hand corner should get you there. Okay, we have a bunch of different organizations that have supported and helped organize Club of Med, and I like to just paste those into the into the chat so that people know. About 10 different evolutionary medicine centers, and also the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health. And we'll run about, 50 minutes or so today with a presentation at the top, and then we'll go into questions. Okay, my name is Charlie Nunn. I'm at Duke University. I run the Triangle Center for Evolutionary Medicine, and I'm in evolutionary anthropology and Duke Global Health. And it's really my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have two of the three here. Nate Dominy, who's the Charles Hansen Professor of Anthropology at Dartmouth. He also has an appointment in biology at Dartmouth, and he's well known for his innovative work on a wide array of different questions and comparative work, many questions in evolutionary anthropology, functional ecology, and also really interesting topics like the effects of climate change on home runs and baseball and other things like that. One of my favorite of Nate's papers. We also have his graduate student, Luke Fannin. Luke is finishing up. When are you finishing, Luke?
This June, actually.
All right. Okay, this June. He's finishing this June. He works on a variety of topics focused on the evolution of foraging strategies, habitat use, and skeleton morphology. And I had the pleasure of meeting him pretty recently, and so that was nice. We also have a third speaker who's not able to make it today because she's in New Zealand, and it's rather inconvenient timing to be giving a talk. And that is Professor Zane Thayer, Associate Professor at Dartmouth, and another person who's making a really strong mark on biological anthropology and evolutionary medicine, a real leader in the field, like Nate and like Luke will be and is becoming. And she investigates how environments shape patterns of human biology and health. So before I turn it over to Nate, I just wanted to say a couple of things. When I've told a few people about this upcoming Club of Med and mentioned monkey bars, it seems that a lot of people seems this has something to do with non-human primates drinking booze. So if you're here to see a talk about monkeys going to bars,
Good idea.
This is not a talk about the drunken monkey hypothesis.
Oh, that's perfect.
It's also kind of ironic because I first heard about this at a bar in New Hampshire with Nate and Luke. Where I got to spend an evening talking about our mutual interest in a lot of different topics. So I think we should actually have a drunken monkey hypothesis talk, and so I'm going to reach out to somebody who could do that. The other thing I wanted to share is that just last night, Nature News published a little piece. I'm going to paste it into the chat, and it's about, it's very much overlapping with what Nate and Luke are going to be talking about from a very different perspective, but still overlapping. And I like to think that the impact of Club of Med, really forced them to try to publish this as quickly as possible, in advance of this important Club of Med. And I do love this paper and I love this work. And so thank you both very much for joining. And I wish Zane could be here too, but it's great to have at least the two of you. So take it away.
All right, thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.
We're thrilled to be here and talking about one of our favorite topics, and Luke will give some of the background for how this paper emerged, how it evolved, and ultimately was published. And I saw that Cynthia Bell is here in the audience, so just want a big shout out to her and thank you to
Cynthia.
her for helping see that paper through. So let's start. Luke, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can share our screen. If we've got screen share, let's do the cool. And let's get this going. Oops. Let's start from the front.
Now, just while you guys are getting set up, I'll just remind people, if you came in and your name is not correct, please update your name on Zoom. We had a little bit of a technical difficulty there.
How's
Okay,
that?
go ahead.
Thanks, Charlie. This is the title of our talk and the title of our recent paper in Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health. We would encourage you to check it out. There's a lot of references there backing up some of the topics today.
There you go. Just click this.
Okay, so I don't know the nature of the audience. I just want to briefly talk about the evolutionary relationships between old world monkeys and other apes. So here we have a phylogeny of old world monkeys and gibbons and orangutans and gorillas and members of Pan. And one of the key distinctions here that you can see is that old world monkeys tend to move with all four limbs touching the surface, whether it's a ground or a branch, whereas apes move in an upright posture, typically hanging beneath branches. So this is a fundamental difference in the way that monkeys and apes move. And it's well illustrated in this particular figure from a recent science paper showing a monkey moving on the surface of a branch. And you'll see that all four limbs are in contact with the substrate. The hip joint and shoulder joints are surprisingly similar. They are enduring similar types of gravitational forces, similar reaction forces from each stride. And so the knee joint and elbow joints, the ankle joints and wrist joints are broadly similar. And these joints are experiencing a regular loading, and so they need to resist those loads by fitting together very properly. So you can imagine these bones fitting together a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle. They need to be stable. So mobility or movement is definitely a detriment to moving on all four limbs. You want to be able to move quickly. You can't afford to be recruiting your muscles to stabilize those joints on a flexible substrate like a branch. Now, for reasons unknown, apes shifted away from that quadrupedal pronograde locomotion with the spine being parallel to the surface of the earth to something altogether different, where apes started to suspend their bodies beneath branches. And this radically changed the kinds of loads that were being experienced by the upper limb. So now the shoulder, instead of experiencing compression from gravity and reaction forces, is now in a state of tension. The shoulder is being pulled apart. Now the arms have to reach and grasp branches in unpredictable angles. And so it favors a lot of mobility, a high degree of mobility at the elbow joint and a high degree of mobility at the wrist joint. So apes and monkeys move in fundamentally different ways, and the ways that they move are reflected in their upper limb anatomy. And we think this is awfully important, and that human evolution is in some ways directly associated with this fundamental shift. Had apes never shifted to this upright type of locomotion, then the spine would have never been pre-adapted for bipedalism, the thing that made all the difference. Okay, so this difference is reflected in a very well-known fictional character, Curious George. Now, I don't know if you remember the very first lines from the very first book. They are, "This is George. He lived in Africa, and he was a curious little monkey." Now, I have to tell you, it's a lie. George was no monkey. George was an ape. Now, Hans Rey was a very gifted illustrator. He was a medical student, and he served in the Kaiser's army as a physician. And so he was trained in anatomical illustration, and he was extremely well attuned to the differences between monkeys and apes. And so when he drew George, and this is an illustration from the very first book where George is escaping from a zoo, and you see that George is holding these balloons, we can imagine the underlying anatomy in the arm of George to facilitate this holding of the balloons. Now, no monkey could ever lift its humerus in this particular way. They can't abduct or abduct the humerus this way. So this is only an ape level of movement at the shoulder joint. Only an ape could have this level of pronation at the elbow joint, and only an ape would have a non-articulating ulnar styloid process at the wrist joint. So this is hallmark ape anatomical traits in Curious George. There's another scene when George encounters the yellow hat from the man with the yellow hat, where George is in a knuckle-based posture. And again, we have the kind of digital anatomy associated with an ape. So I just wanted to alert everyone that even though George is described as a curious monkey, he is unquestionably an ape. And so these fundamental differences in ape and monkey anatomy got us to thinking a lot about the selective pressures that favor these kinds of anatomies. And our discipline has long focused on suspension from branches or the act of climbing vertically into the canopy. Now, Luke here started to think a little bit differently about this problem, and this motivated some of his recent research. Okay, take it away, Luke.
Thank you, Nate. So we were really interested in sort of this, basically the transition from being pronograde to orthograde. And we were thinking about the kinds of contexts by which the abducted shoulder and the extended elbow would be very important. And there had been some debates from actually watching apes move in the canopy that some of these locomotions were more important than others. So previously it had been talked about that vertical climbing was important for having these very mobile shoulders. So vertical climbing is when you're moving sort of at a greater than 45-degree angle from parallel up into the canopy, where you don't necessarily have a lot of branches. But some had argued, no, it's actually more of a suspensory movement. You know, you're distributing your arms across a bunch of branches. And so this is work that we did actually with an undergrad who's now a graduate student at Duke, Mary Joy, where we wanted to quantify basically how shoulders were moving in apes and in monkeys in natural contexts, and try to figure out whether vertical climbing really did create the kinds of environments that promoted this, this sort of greater mobility. And what we found was that, yeah, vertical climbing is important, but it's really only important when you're going down a tree. And I won't go into the details, but we think it has to do a lot with safety as you move down. Gravity is going to exert a greater amount of, is going to make it a lot easier for you to slip when you're going down versus going up a tree. And so we published this, and what was nice is it got a lot of media attention, which we were really surprised about. But when we were talking a bit with journalists about sort of the impacts of this for regular people, you know, and the broader impacts, as the NSF would say, we talked a lot about playgrounds, and that really a lot of these derived ape traits you see a lot of times in kids when they're playing, and especially on playgrounds, and especially on these things called monkey bars, which are, you can see here in front of Marion Cross School. This is in Norwich, Vermont. And so this made us kind of want to explore where this name came from, because as Nate says, you know, they're called monkey bars, but this is really an ape kind of locomotion. So we wanted to dig in a little bit and figure out, you know, where this name came from. And, you know, and when we dug into it, what we really found was this really fascinating story about a guy named Ted Hinton. And Ted was a patent attorney in Winnetka, Illinois. And in 1923, he published his first patent with the U.S. Patent Office for something called a climbing structure. And then later in 1924, he published an addendum to it where he added what he termed the monkey runway. So this structure on the right here, this is what was referred to as the climbing structure, or jungle gym, as it would later be called. Really sort of a lot of different, it was very geometric, made out of metal with all these bracings. And then if you look on the right here, this is the image from the later patent. There's a raised platform with all of the bars there, and that is what he termed the monkey runway, which later on became the monkey bars. So what a lot of people don't realize is that the monkey bars and the jungle gym were a part of the same structure. And I won't go into the details about Ted's life, but he was heavily influenced by his dad, who was a mathematician. He actually formulated the mathematical concept of the tesseract and was really interested in dimensionality. So when Ted was a kid, his dad was always trying to get him to understand the use of space and how it impacted his life. So really influenced by his dad. And that story is in our paper, but I'll just briefly talk about it here. What was more important is that when you actually read the patent text, there seems to be evolutionary theory in a patent, which is what we think is the first incidence of someone actually using evolutionary theory to justify a patent application. So I've highlighted a couple passages here. This one I think is particularly important because he talks about climbing being the natural method of locomotion, with which the evolutionary predecessors of the human race were designed to practice, which then he talks about may be important for children. And he constantly brings up this sort of monkey instinct being strong in all human beings and perhaps most clearly displayed in children. So this is really evolutionary reasoning being used. And then this is sort of the kicker. With these theories and facts in mind, he's designed this climbing apparatus that is very much like, this is verbatim, a forest top with which a troop of children may play in a manner somewhat similar to a troop of monkeys. So the name monkey bars actually came from the evolutionary justification, which is really fascinating. So we thought that this legacy would have been carried over into the 21st century. And what we actually found was that the debate about the monkey bars had shifted from being sort of this biological structure to a structure that was the center of this debate about risky, adventurous, or thrill-seeking play. And I've just briefly defined it here. It's play that is thrilling, but it also carries the risk of injury. So monkey bars are at the center of this 21st century debate about this risk of this play, because it is incredibly important. It's been hypothesized to be beneficial for childhood growth and development, but it carries the risk of injury. So it is often drawn the attention of public health officials as well as city planners to deal with the fact that monkey bars, while incredibly fun, also cause a lot of injuries, which we'll talk about later. So I just want to give a brief kind of outline of where we're going here. So the origins of this structure are in biological anthropology and a little bit of mathematics. But most of the 21st century debate, which I've outlined in this box here, has to do with the costs. And we'll talk about the costs of this structure. And a lot of the costs, both physical and emotional, have to do with the medicine and the public health sphere. And then the benefits are often also couched in developmental and physical terms in terms of physical health for children. And this is generally the purview of developmental psychologists. And as we were going through and trying to conceptualize this debate, we suddenly realized, where did biological anthropology go? It has disappeared from the debates and the discourse about monkey bars, which is crazy because it started as a justification based in biological anthropology. So let's dig into some of the costs. Why are the monkey bars somewhat controversial? And it turns out they cause a ton of skeletal injuries. So it's been estimated that about 7% of all childhood arm fractures in the US are caused by a fall from the jungle gym or the monkey bars, which is very, very significant. About 50% of playground extremity fractures, which are, your extremities, your limbs, that are admitted to the ED are from the monkey bars, and around 55% of any sort of severe extremity fracture, as it's classified, are coming from the monkey bars. And it turns out most of these are falls from heights. So the risk statistics have been calculated in the past, and it's been estimated that if you fall from about 2 meters, which is about 7 feet tall, which is generally the average height of the platform by which monkey bars are being used, you have about an 11 times higher risk of fracturing an arm than, say, below 1 meter. So most monkey bars fall within this 2 to 1.5 meter range. So a bit injurious. And so a lot of public health officials, people that and doctors have written tons and tons of articles about either regulating these things or removing them. And this especially started to tick up in the 1980s and the 1990s, where you have the first publishing of the US Consumer Product Safety Commission handbook, where they actually tried to take some of this data and synthesize it into recommendations for city planners. And a lot of these recommendations were around reducing the height to below about 2 meters, as you can see from that previous statistic. Okay, that makes a little sense. And making the surfaces deeper and more compliant. So they really were trying to prevent fracture from happening. And they thought, okay, deeper surfaces, reduced heights, reduces the impact from falls, which most of these are happening. The problem with this was that it was really, really, really difficult and expensive to change these things. So what ended up happening were a lot of playgrounds, especially a lot of monkey bars, started to close. So we have this diagram here. This is a monkey bar set, jungle gym that was a picture taken in New York in 1942. And you can see all the kids playing on it. There's a lot of social play. And then in 1996, it has been closed. It's been cordoned off, and it will eventually be removed. And this got a lot of developmental psychologists and concerned because they had been in tandem with the public health officials studying how beneficial risky play is. And they said, well, I think maybe we're going a little overboard here. And they would compellingly argue against it. They would say, are really monkey bars, are they too hazardous for kids to use? And if you put a broader context on it, death on playgrounds is relatively rare. It's around a 1 in 30 million chance that a kid will die in a playground. You actually have a higher risk of dying on the drive to the playground. And additionally, injury risk is pretty low. It's between 0.26 to 0.59 cases per about 100,000 uses. And I just want to show a diagram here. And this is sort of the injuries per 1,000 hours of physical activity. And on the left here is sort of leisure time physical activity, which they put monkey bars under. And it's far dwarfed by things like sports, much higher risk of injuries, especially clinically diagnosed injuries and medically treated injuries, and then gym class. So monkey bars are actually relatively safe when it comes to being risky. And they also started to dig in a little more into the fracture data, and although fractures are pretty common on the monkey bars, they're actually often low severity. So a lot of fractures, when kids go into the ER to deal with them, they're often released on the same day. And the kinds of fractures that are produced are not often that serious. For example, most of them are these so-called green stick fractures, which is the analogy is if you have a supple piece of wood and you try to break it, you don't necessarily break through the entire thing, and it kind of creates just sort of a crack in the structure, a green stick fracture. And a lot of these fractures can be healed in about 3 or 4 weeks' time and generally immobilized with these soft casts that you see on the right here. And oftentimes you can get a good amount of displacement without necessarily needing to be referred to an orthopedist. So a lot of developmental psychologists would counter and say, no, these monkey bars aren't necessarily hazardous, they're risky, but the relative hazard of them is lower compared to a lot of other activities that we let our kids do, especially organized activities like sports. And so they started to push back a little bit. And a very, very sort of keystone paper in this debate was the antiphobic hypotheses, or the risky play hypotheses for adventurous play. And this was formulated by Aaron Sandsetter. And she made the argument, and she's continued to make the argument, that risky play is really beneficial for the development of kids. And basically, she makes the argument that in play, you have a chance to actually work through and deal with challenges. So these are challenges that kids need to overcome, but they happen in relatively low risk environments. And so she makes a bit of an evolutionary argument where she says, yes, things like heights and moving on playgrounds are scary for kids. There's a little bit of a fear, but that fear of heights, of falling, is coupled with thrill. So the actual excitement of navigating the structure. And when you couple fear and thrill, you get excitement, and it allows you to engage in that activity. And then as you continue to engage with it, the fear you experience goes down a little bit, and it continues to go down. And she argued that this was important for allowing kids to develop confidence and belief in themselves. And they made the counter argument that a lot of the current mental health, the rise in sort of anxiety, depression, internalizing symptoms, was due to this fact that kids just don't have enough time to work through challenges by themselves anymore. And the loss of monkey bars and free play more generally was crucial to this. And they also accrued some physical benefits, so this adventurous play. So regardless of the psychology, when kids engage in risky play on the monkey bars, their physical activity increases about 12%. There's been some arguments that it improves motor training. And for example, kids that are more likely to free play, they tend to have more developed coordination And when they play, they tend to engage in what's called self-handicapping, which is putting themselves in these moderately stressful and scary situations that they have to overcome. And it's very much like exposure therapy, where they build confidence through that. And then there's also some enhancements in skeletal mass and strength. So, when kids are playing around, bone strength tends to increase over time, especially as their bones are developing, and bone mineral content tends to be higher in kids that are engaged in more active play. And this tends to be maintained throughout their ontogeny. So the physical benefits were there and the psychological developmental benefits were there, but we felt that given that the monkey bars originated from a biological anthropology perspective, it's been 100 years. What is the selective benefits around play and suspension, and how can we contextualize the importance of risky play within biological anthropology? It's back to you, Nate.
Sure. So thanks, Luke. So that shift from pronogrady, that monkey way of moving, to orthogrady, the ape way of moving, we don't know why exactly it happened. We don't know what the incentives were. Probably better access to fruits, we think. But at minimum, it was more perilous. So suspending from a branch by only 2 points of contact is substantially riskier. And we see the costs of that shift in the bones that we recover from multiple field sites and the bones that we see in museum collections. A large fraction of bones show evidence of fractures, and they're long bones. And these fractures are pretty similar to the types of fractures we see in children falling from monkey bars. Now, there's a video on the left here showing an orangutan in Borneo, and you'll see the nature of a dipterocarp tree. These are difficult trees to climb. There's a large branchless component, and these animals have to essentially slide down. So just wanted to illustrate for you the challenges of navigating this complicated three-dimensional landscape for an ape that depends on suspensory locomotion. All right. And we see evidence of falls. So not only do we know that falls happen fairly regularly today in living primates, we even have evidence in the hominin fossil record. So this is some photographs of bones from Lucy. You see her right humerus and her left humerus, and both of these bones show evidence of compressive fractures at the proximal end, green stick fractures, which is the most common type of fracture we see in children falling from monkey bars, and other kinds of fractures at the distal part of the radius. These fractures are extremely consistent with modern day children falling from the monkey bars. And it's been hypothesized by a group of authors at the University of Texas that maybe this was even the cause of Lucy's death, that she fell out of a tree of approximately, what was it, 13 meters?
13 meters,
yeah, that was their estimate. So we know it happens, and this is an argument that would suggest that falling is part of the natural biology of primates, that developing the motor skills, the coordination for successful arborealism will require some level of falling, and being able to tolerate and heal from those falls may be a factor that's baked into the biology of primates.
And so we hypothesized, and it's been hypothesized before, that selection should operate pretty strongly on juvenile primates to both master the art of climbing, as Nate was talking about. It's really challenging to do, but also to protect them from inexperience. So here's another video of some chimps in Budongo, which is in Uganda. So you can see the one on the left is a kid, and it falls, just straight falls from the canopy right next to its mom. So the mom slowly and deliberately and very skilled climbs to the ground and goes and checks on Junior. And you can see right about now, infant comes over, or the juvenile comes over, and, mom checks on them. They're okay. And we see this in behavioral records. The juvenile chimps spend about 40% more time being arboreal than similar adults in the same environments. They spend about 27% more time vertically climbing than adults, and around 15% more time being suspensory. So kids are behaviorally engaging in these more risky behaviors, and we think this is practice. They're getting used to their bodies moving in the canopy in these really complicated ways, and it's helping them to later become really we would say ecologically competent adults is how I would phrase it. And it does look like juvenile primates are more durable. So this is some work by Jesse Young at NeoUCOM, close to in Ohio. And he looked at what's called the generalized safety factor, the GSF, of capuchins as they moved around. And he found that the highest bone strengths, basically their ability to resist loads in both the humerus and the femur, are far higher in younger individuals, and especially those individuals that are about at the onset of independent locomotion and then locomotor independence. So there is this exponential decline, and then right as around when they get to juvenility and into adulthood, it tends to flatline. So, durability is baked into the young primate skeleton. And so obviously there's a safety margin, but then what's selection acting on to promote this? And this is some really interesting work that came out a few years ago, and they looked at, okay, you have a bunch of juveniles that are engaging in play, like how does this affect their ontogeny? And what they found out was that better chimpanzee quote unquote players reach key developmental milestones faster. So these are so when they say percent time in social play, most social play in chimpanzees is risky physical play. They're moving around in the canopy, they're wrestling in the canopy, they're falling out of the canopy. And the more time that an individual spent in social play, it actually sped up their ability to travel independently. So there's a negative correlation here. And it also sped up the time by which they engaged in their first social groom of a non-maternal individual. And I didn't include a third panel here, but individuals that engaged in more social play, they actually engaged in their first mating more quickly, which in chimpanzees is a huge deal. And so there is fitness benefits that arise from being a better player, at least in non-human primates. But why does biological anthropology matter to this particular debate? We can contextualize climbing all we want and human climbing all we want, but why does it matter? And it turns out that those playground safety standards that I had talked about earlier are very inconsistently applied across different contexts. For example, in Australia and in Europe, the maximum free fall height is actually much higher than in other countries. So for example, it's around 2.5 to 3 meters tall. And in fact, this is much different than the United States when it's around 1.5 meters. And even clinicians favor lower heights due to statistical data on fractures. So some clinicians argue less than 2 meters or even less than 1.5 meters. So you have even inconsistency between the actual clinical recommendations and what the actual safety standards are. And the question is, like, why are there inconsistencies? And we think a lot of this has to do with the lack of kinematic data. We know almost nothing about the actual joint movements and postures that kids engage with on playgrounds. So we can say, okay, from this height, they're more likely to fracture themselves, but we know very little about the behavioral context by which those falls were occurring. Are they using the playground equipment correctly? Are they using it incorrectly? For example, this kind of posture that this child is using here is what we would call risk compensation. So in a risk compensation scenario, perhaps playground equipment isn't as stimulating, and so kids will actually use it incorrectly to increase the amount of risk to make it more fun. And so what we are arguing here is that we need to study kids using playgrounds very much like we study non-human primates in their natural environments. Measure the angles by which they use their shoulders and elbows, the kinds of grips that they use. And we think this will help us to actually finding biologically relevant regulations that then we can use to inform both public health and city planning. And we just want to end with this idea that we need to remember our ancestry, our deep evolutionary ancestry, when we try to talk about children's play. And because we think it allows us to make more mindful and more and more, I guess, more mindful regulators. And we just want to end with the statement that when we're talking about play, it's important to make play as safe as necessary, but not necessarily as safe as possible. And we think going along and contributing to this would be understanding the contexts and the movements that kids use when they're engaging with playground equipment. And we think that this is incredibly important and a definite need for future studies. So that ends sort of the talk portion. We just want to acknowledge a few things. And if anybody has any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to me at my email. I'm happy to chat further about these things.
Stop share.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, thank you, Nate and Luke. That was fantastic. Perfect. Exactly what we're hoping for with Club of Med. We have a couple of comments in the chat, and I'd also love to see some hands raised and people asking questions. I thought I'd first turn to Mark, if you're still on, Mark Tremblay, to say a little bit about your comment in the chat, if you're willing to.
Sure.
There we are.
First, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks for the presentation and the paper. It's it's interesting how I stumbled upon this. So I'm a professor of pediatrics at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario in Ottawa, Canada. But I'm an exercise physiologist by training. So I come at all of this from a physical activity promotion angle. But I also wear the hat as president of Outdoor Play Canada, and I've been working kind of in this area of reconnecting kids with the outdoors and pushing back on the bubble wrapping of kids and that whole thing for quite some time. But the way I stumbled upon this paper, my oldest son is a professor, probably closer aligned to what you folks do than what I do. And he knows the work that I do. And so he sent me the paper and I looked at it, and he does, I mean, he goes and he does cardiovascular checkups on kids and chimpanzees in sanctuaries throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And he's part of the primate heart study and so on. So anyways, he sent me this, and I was reading it from my perspective, which again is quite different than I think most people on the call, but its relevance is enormous. I mean, one is it's another angle for us. So I put in the chat that I led a position statement in 2015 because I was just getting angered by the cherry picking of information of frankly public health officials that the outdoors was too dangerous because kids might fall, they might get abducted, they might get bit by a mosquito, they might get sunburned, they might get too hot, they might get too cold, they might get too dry, they might get too wet, whatever. Like, there is no time to be safe outdoors. And to me, as a physical activity promotion person, this is the only scalable and sustainable solution to the global inactivity crisis and the obesity epidemic that we've experienced because of this. So anyways, that's a little bit, maybe too much background on me, but some of you may have read The Anxious Generation, a book by developmental psychologist Jonathan Haidt, and it's really all about about screen time, excessive screen time, and how it's damaging kids' brains, bodies, emotions, and so on. But a very strong thesis within there is that we've lost a play-based childhood and the consequences of that to development. And of course, when you expose kids to a monkey bar, or frankly anything that challenges them, when they've had less exposure, there's greater risk for them to fall. Same with the monkey, I imagine. If you held a monkey on the ground or an ape on the ground and never let them climb, when they did climb, they're at greater risk of falling. And right, biology looks after that if you just let it be. Exactly like your videos showed, they'll try at low things, they'll fall, they'll fail, they'll learn, and so on. Kids the same. But because of the screen-based generation and stuff, we've more or less removed that from people's life. And this Yeah, and then the other angle that you talked about, and we call the lulling effect, you know, you showed the kid hanging upside down by the monkey bars and using things not the way they were designed, but a way that can provide some stimulation, some thrill, some challenge, force them to make decisions, learn their limits and those sorts of things. We call that the lulling effect, and I testified on that in a silly lawsuit in Alberta where, anyways, I won't get into it, but this is an ongoing issue here. So anyways, I just want to say thanks that, you know, as we're doing a 10th anniversary update to our position statement, we're making it global, not just Canada centric, and we're expanding it substantially in terms of its reach as we learn more and more the developmental benefits of active outdoor play. And so with your paper, you know, it's another bullet point that we don't consider at all. We're looking at social issues, we're looking at health related issues, we're looking at medical issues, not anthropological development related issues. And so so it's really cool. So anyway, sorry for taking so long, but that's why
This is perfect. This is great.
Mark, what is Canada doing? Because in 2008, the EU actually increased the allowable height of monkey bars, and the United States has decreased it. So we're getting divergent directions in EU and Canada and in US. So what position is Canada taking?
Yeah, so so if I go back to when we did the 2015 position statement, the CSA, Canadian Standards Association, that's the system that creates the rules for everything from hockey helmets to monkey bars and playgrounds and so on. In the case of playgrounds, the people on the CSA committee are people that sell playground equipment. And so we went through a long period, still going on, where we have plastic playgrounds, plastic structures. You know, they're careful not to have them that they can hang kids and different things like that. But also the surfaces that kids fall onto were plasticized. A fair bit of research showing that it actually creates risk of fracture, like a double bounce on a trampoline, and that you know, sand or sawdust or something would actually be better than what these people were selling. I think now, because there is some traction, there is a bit of movement happening with, you know, the whole get outdoors, nature deficit disorder, pushback, and trying to reconnect a generation of kids that are stuck on small screens to get outside. And so there's a bit of momentum around adventure playgrounds and natural playgrounds. So so that would be at the expense of monkey bars, but at the promotion of trees that kids can climb, real monkey bars or ape bars. And so that and that's something that we're trying to push, you know, loose parts. Let's use natural elements, logs, rocks, trees, you know, burns, angles in the natural environment and so on. I wouldn't say that's caught wildfire. Still, most things are bright red and yellow plastic things that are typically so dumbed down that the attention span, like kids are bored with it. Like I live right across from a little park that has one of these plastic units and a little wee slide that, you know, is a really low angle. And no kids go down it, but all kinds of kids run up it. And of course, it wasn't made to run up, but it's a little more challenging than the boring little wee ride down.
If I can answer Robert's question in the chat, he asked, are young apes and monkeys playing at lower heights than adults going for food? Generally, yes, because a lot of what we're seeing is that the adults rest on the ground and then the kids are playing just above them. But it's not, you do have some instances where kids can play relatively high up. It's less common, but most of the adults are going to climb a bit higher because they're reaching sort of those terminal branches for food, and they're going to climb up sort of those sort of bare trunks, and those tend to be a little bit higher up in the emergent canopy. So a lot of social play happens a bit lower. But I mean, the physics of kids, I mean, that height I think is probably pretty relative. They probably still think they're pretty high, but that from my understanding, that's our we don't know enough about the actual height that juvenile primates live in the canopy. We still don't have a lot of data on that. It's not something that's commonly collected in studies of locomotion, but it should be.
Okay, great. Matt, would you like to ask your question or make a comment? Good to see you, by the way.
Sure, I'd love to, and good to see you too, Charlie. Thank you, Nate and Luke, for your talk. Fascinating, and Mark, thank you for your added commentary. So I'm a developmental psychologist, and so this was just, having me grinning the last hour. And my PhD advisor, much of her work, she's Liz Dalala, and she's done a lot of work in play behaviors in preschoolers.
Yeah.
My dissertation actually also then explored motor behaviors in preschoolers. I had an observational study that I did, and so I appreciated the specific focus on monkey bars, and I wanted to ask you all, like, what other motor behaviors maybe I should be thinking about? And then I also appreciated us broadening it from monkey bars specifically, or that locomotion, to play generally. And Mark, thank you for, adding in the outdoor play specifically. I'm an eco-psychologist, and so nature is like what I'm trying to get my early career to focus on. But yeah, so I guess I'm wondering y'all's thoughts on like the shifting landscapes that we have in modernity, and more of us are spending times on screens, our children are spending times indoors, and maybe just any thoughts on like how locomotion and motor behavior is changing.
So Matt, there was a paper that we came across, and it might have been yours, that children report far more positive feelings about playground equipment that is that moves beneath them. If you imagine a balance beam that is on joints, that is unstable, those are far more fulfilling types of playground equipment. And so that type of compliance, I think, is interesting, because in some ways it mimics branches in the natural environment, because a branch isn't static. It's deforming under your body mass. And it seems like children are craving that kind of deformation of the structure. And I would say that's one limitation of monkey bars, is they tend to be rigid. That overhead ladder is fixed. And it would be a lot better, I think, if we had a monkey bars that could somehow sway under the child's weight, or move a little bit. A little bit of displacement could be a big improvement on playground equipment. And the work that you do would be really crucial, I think, to testing if that's true or not.
One idea I've had too is if you watch, say, orangutans or even chimpanzees in their environment, our feet are much different than theirs. They almost basically have four hands, right? So that ability to suspend themselves by their legs, especially in an orangutan, and distribute their body weight, they're really good at it. But of course, they have a grasping pollex, right? So the idea that when kids risk compensate, a lot of times they hang by their legs. And that is a different sensation, because they basically have to grab between sort of in their knee joint, basically, right behind their knee joint. And I'm really wondering, at what context and height does that occur? Because I would imagine that the probability of falling is much higher there than it is when you're normally just grasping.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting. Thank you
And then,
both.
and then what context that occurs, yeah.
Yeah, and the context, and that's also kind of making me think, or I'm reflecting on maybe the differences of what us adults, or us developed mature individuals at this point in our lifespans, how we view children's play. And children don't want this, or they're spending all their time inside, or they want the screens. And then like you just said, Luke, maybe actually the children, or Nate, like you were saying, the children want to be outside. They want these kind of dynamic locomotion opportunities. Uh, oh, wow. Yeah. Thank you guys so much again.
Hey, Nate and Luke, as I was reading your paper and thinking about playgrounds becoming safer, less risky, the other thing that occurred to me that's really changed since I was a child is the ability to just free range, to explore the environment. When I grew up, I was running all over the neighborhood and well beyond the neighborhood, and somehow made it back to dinner every night, at about the
Yeah.
right time. And we've really lost that. That's no longer, parents don't want to do it, and then neighbors, also comment on it if you do let that happen. And I was trying to think about, the relevance of that, and was, just curious if you, in a biological anthropology perspective, and for example, in fission fusion sociality of, great apes, of chimpanzees, things like that. Do you have any thoughts about that side of it?
So one idea that I think kind of goes back to the social consequences is this idea behind mixed age play and how common it is in free play. And so a lot of times when you're looking at free play around the world, you have instances where bigger kids are actually associating with littler kids. And that happens in great apes, it happens in humans. And it's been hypothesized that this idea has multiple angles. One, you're in a larger group and you have bigger kids watching smaller kids, so you give the smaller kids more free reign because you have mentors there. But then it also helps kind of facilitate more of a collective movement and collective play, because if you're with a mixed age group of different abilities, the ability to play and come together, it requires opt-in from everybody. So it almost becomes the sort of collective action issue where everybody has to agree to the rules. And then the minute that maybe abilities get over, one's abilities kind of fall to the wayside relative to the others, that person opts out. They have the ability to opt out. And that induces the other people to lower their sort of threshold for who gets involved, right? And it kind of creates this ability for really robust play, but also really flexible play. And so I think part of the reason is like, we just don't have the kinds of neighborhood structures anymore where kids can go out together and almost form sort of these roving groups of juveniles, right? And they kind of walk. That's what, when I was a kid, I lived in a small sort of rural subdivision where, we just had free reign of the development, and we all kind of watched each other and looked out for each other. And I think right now, because of the way our current neighborhoods are structured, it's just a little bit more isolating. So that kind of mixed age sort of spontaneous play doesn't happen anymore. And so I have to imagine that's a pretty common thing. When I'm watching living primates in their environments, it's always mixed age play. It's always a 1-year-old playing with a 3-year-old, or vice versa. And there's a bunch of them and they're chasing each other around. And then one gets stressed, so it goes back to mom, and then the play breaks up and then it starts up again at maybe a reduced level. So that's what I think of when I think of that sort of reduction in free ranging movement.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to fit in 2 more questions here. You guys might remember Sylvia, my daughter, who is very interested in child development and psychology. Go ahead, Sylvia, and then we'll get the the version of it, Jennifer, who has her hand up. Or his hand.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sylvia. I'm a senior in high school, and I'm really interested in developmental psychology. I got the opportunity to meet Nate and Luke. I was there. And I thought this whole conversation was really amazing, especially as someone who loved monkey bars and that type of play as a kid. And now I do a lot more structured sports. And so I was interested to hear about any research that had been done about the benefits of play versus the benefits of sports, because as you showed, there were much higher risks of injury in organized sports. And sorry, I'm at school. But also, play is something that's been around, as you've shown, in apes and monkeys, and at least in apes, sorry. And so I was interested to hear kind of perspectives about, did we evolve for sports, and how the benefits psychologically and physically kind of differ from play that's so natural.
I think part of the sport issue is, I think when sports are naturally generated through the collective action of children and is scaled to ability and is opt in, opt out. Like, imagine you're in the neighborhood and you guys want to play a pickup game of basketball, and maybe you've got 2 8-year-olds and a 12-year-old, but you need 4, right? So then maybe you recruit a 6-year-old, then you decide, okay, 12-year-old's going with the 6-year-old and the 8-year-old's going with the 10-year-old, and that's going to be fair, right? And so there's this ability that's the only way the game happens. But when you deal with, I think the injury problem is when you deal with organized sports, the motivation goes from being internalized, and you want to do it, to then the motivation becomes externalized. So you have coaches, you have fans, and sometimes that can induce kids to go past their limits. So maybe they make a harder tackle because they get more cheers, or maybe they decide to challenge one of the strikers as a defender harder because they know that their teammates are going to be cheering them on. So even though it might go past their abilities. And so I think part of that might be the reason you get sort of the increase in sort of the injuries. And then I think we've sort of changed the incentive structure around sports to becoming less about the joy of the game more generally, and more about the consequences of being good. And I think when you externalize those consequences, kids are more likely, or students are much more likely, to push themselves because they know that the rewards, scholarships, the ability to gain social status amongst their peers goes up because we value those kinds of things. So I'm not saying one is worse than the other. I'm just saying there are trade-offs. You want to jump in, Nate?
No, I thought that was great.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. Thank you guys for the answer too. Sylvia, get to class, okay? Don't be late to class. Okay, one last question from not Jennifer Hurchin. Go ahead with your hand up. Yes, sorry.
Hi.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was fantastic. So my question was, did you look backwards in time? So did you actually look at some different locations and some different equipment and over time to see if there was a change in the actual occurrence of injuries? Looking at maybe changes in the actual sort of surface of the ground underneath the playground equipment, or the material that the equipment was made out of, looking for variations that way?
You saw data, right? That the injuries from monkey bars have been flat 3 times,
Yeah,
even with changes in the substrate.
So that's the interesting thing people have looked at because right around the modifications kind of happened around the late 80s into the 90s, when you really got sort of the proliferation of it. And if you look at, they've done it for sort of the most popular things, the slides, the swings. So the swings have been getting safer from an injury perspective. There's a pretty strong negative correlation from the past to the present for injury rates. Monkey bars are surprisingly resilient to modification in terms of the number of injuries they cause. It tends to be flat, and there's a study that went from 1992 to maybe 2003. It was pretty flat, and then a recent one looked at 2006 to 2019, and it's also flat. And so the monkey bars are, I mean, this is still puzzling a lot of public health officials. They're like, well, the monkey bars are still, they still cause quite a few injuries. And we think that risk compensation angle is playing a little bit of a role here, that kids just use monkey bars in riskier ways. And then they continue to ratchet up that risk, even if we make the surfacing a little bit more compliant or reduce the height. And so I guess that's still something that we need some data on, the actual postural changes over time, because we just don't know the behaviors that are causing that flat line. Are the behaviors the same, or are they changing too?
Okay. Okay, we should wrap up. We've gone a little bit long, I guess, because we started a little bit late. This was a great presentation, great discussion afterwards. Thank you all for tuning in, and especially thanks to Nate and Luke for presenting, and to Jennifer for organizing everything. Stay tuned. We have more Club Ed Meds coming up. We're going to have a series of talks that are going to focus on evolution-proof strategies for cancer, infectious disease, and vector control. And so we'll have about 3 or 4 talks oriented around that from very different perspectives. More details coming soon. Okay, thanks again, Nate and Luke. Great to see everybody.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank
Thanks,
you, everybody.
everyone.